Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. I had always believed that I knew my husband inside and out. We had been together for 6 years, married for 3, and I trusted him with all my heart. He had always been this charming, seemingly perfect man who would do anything for me. But that day, everything shattered in one single moment. I had been cleaning out our spare room, which had turned into a small storage area, when I found an old box shoved in the corner. It was covered in dust, tucked away behind stacks of paperwork. The box itself looked unimportant, just another forgotten item. But something in my gut told me to open it. Inside, I found a collection of old military documents, photos of my husband in uniform, and several awards and commendations that I had never seen before. I stood frozen, staring at the items spread out before me. I had always known that my husband had served in the military, but this wasn't just service. This was something different. I started flipping through the photos and papers, slowly piecing together a picture I hadn't expected. There was one photo of him in full uniform, standing with a group of men I didn't recognize, but what caught my attention was the look in his eyes. Something cold, something distant. It was as if the man in the photo wasn't the man I had married, and that realization struck me hard. As I went through more papers, I found references to places I had never heard of, operations I couldn't even begin to understand. The more I read, the more I began to feel sick to my stomach. There were mentions of secret missions, military tactics that involved actions I didn't want to believe were real. But they were, right in front of me. I couldn't understand it. How could I not have known about this side of him? I felt a deep, sinking feeling in my chest, and panic began to set in. I had to know more. Why had he kept all of this hidden from me? Why hadn't he shared this part of his life with me? I waited for him to come home that evening, but the anger and confusion built up inside me, and by the time he walked through the door, I couldn't hold it in any longer. What is all of this? I asked, holding up the papers, the photos. Why didn't you ever tell me about this? He froze at the sight of the box, his face draining of color. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. His shoulders were tense, and I noticed how his hands were trembling slightly. I couldn't believe it. My perfect husband, the man I trusted with my whole heart, was hiding something so big from me. I had always known he had been in the military, but these were things I had never been told. He had always downplayed his service, said it was nothing special. But now I knew the truth, and it terrified me. He looked at me with a forced smile, his voice shaky. "It's not what you think," he said, but his words fell flat. I wasn't sure I could trust him anymore. I pressed him for answers. "Then what is it? What have you been hiding from me?" But he refused to explain, saying only that it was in the past. "It's over. It was a long time ago, and I don't want to talk about it anymore," he said. But his words didn't comfort me. In fact, they made everything worse. Why was he so defensive? What was he trying to protect? And more importantly, why did he think I wouldn't understand? I had always supported him. Always. But this felt like a betrayal, something I could never have imagined. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, tossing and turning. The image of those documents and photos burned into my mind. What had I married into? How could I have been so blind? As the hours passed, I made a decision. I had to know the full truth. I wasn't going to let this slide, not when there were so many unanswered questions. The next day, while he was at work, I went through the box again. This time, I was more determined. I rifled through the papers, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. That's when I found the letter. It was tucked inside an envelope, and it looked like it had been opened several times. The handwriting was familiar. His? I unfolded the letter carefully, reading each word with growing unease. It was a letter from one of his former commanders, written in a cold, formal tone. The letter described a mission that my husband had been a part of. But this mission wasn't one that anyone would want to brag about. It involved actions that were morally questionable, things that I couldn't even process. The letter was vague, but the undertones were clear. My husband had been involved in something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The letter spoke of covering up certain actions and doing what was necessary for the greater good. But I couldn't see how this could ever be justified. My heart pounded in my chest as I read on. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could my husband, the man I loved, have been involved in something so monstrous? I had always thought of him as a hero. How could I have been so wrong? I felt betrayed. The trust one had placed in him was slipping away, and in its place, a deep sense of anger and confusion was growing. I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at the military, at the lies, at the system that had turned my husband into someone I didn't recognize. But what was worse, I was angry at myself. How could I have missed this? How could I have not seen the warning signs? I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of the truth. I didn't know how to look at him the same way anymore. The person I had married, the man who had held me when I was sad, who had supported me in every way, was slipping away. And the person who was taking his place was someone I couldn't even comprehend. When my husband came home that night, I was already waiting. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore. The woman who had married him, who had loved him so completely, felt like a stranger now. The air between us was thick with tension, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. When he walked through the door, I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I just looked at him, my heart racing with both fear and anger. He knew what was coming. He could see it in my eyes. "You went through the box, didn't you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, and I could hear the nervousness behind it. It sent a chill down my spine. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The truth was out, and it was worse than I could have ever imagined. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. I had to hold back the tears. "Why did you keep all of this from me?" I could barely keep the shock from my voice. The man standing before me was no longer the man I had fallen in love with. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone I was scared to be near. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words didn't come out right. He was stammering, as if he wasn't sure where to start or how to explain himself. "It's not what you think," he said finally, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "No, it's exactly what I think," I snapped, my anger bubbling up to the surface. "I found the letter, and I read everything. I know about the missions, the lies, the cover-ups. How could you do this? How could you live with yourself knowing what you've done?" He took a step forward, reaching out to me, but I flinched away. His touch, which used to bring me comfort, now felt foreign and unwanted. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice full of desperation. "You don't understand. You don't know what it was like." "I don't care," I shouted. "I don't care about your excuses. You were part of something so terrible, and you hid it from me. For years, I trusted you. And you let me down. You betrayed me." I could see the guilt in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. Nothing could make me forgive him. He took another step toward me, but this time, I didn't back away. I stood my ground, the weight of everything crashing down on me. "Why? Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" "I couldn't," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to hate me." His words were a confession, but they didn't make things better. They only made the hole in my heart grow wider. I could barely look at him anymore. The man I had loved was lost, and in his place was a stranger who had done terrible things. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. He didn't reply. The silence that fell between us was suffocating. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say or do next. The truth had torn us apart, and I didn't know how we could ever fix it. My world, once so solid and predictable, had crumbled in an instant. In the days that followed, things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. Every conversation felt forced, every word laced with tension. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter, about the things my husband had done in the name of duty. I hated the military, but I hated him even more for hiding this from me. I spent hours researching the operations he had been involved in, searching for answers, trying to make sense of it all. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. The things he had done, the things he had justified in his mind, were things I couldn't ignore. I couldn't just sweep them under the rug and pretend they didn't happen. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine. I began to question everything about him. All the little things that had seemed so insignificant before now felt like lies. The way he talked about his service, how he always downplayed it, made me sick. I couldn't reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man I was learning about. The man who had laughed with me, who had comforted me when I was sad, was now a man I feared. He tried to apologize, tried to explain himself, but his words fell on deaf ears. I couldn't forgive him. I couldn't pretend like everything was okay. Every time he touched me, I felt disgusted. Every time he looked at me, I saw the guilt in his eyes, and it made me hate him even more. One evening, I confronted him again. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "Why didn't you trust me enough to share this with me? You think I would have just accepted it?" "I thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice low and full of regret. "I thought I was keeping you safe from the things I had to do. I didn't want you to see me like this." But his words didn't make things better. They only deepened the wound. I didn't want him to protect me from the truth. I wanted to know who he really was. But now, I wished I had never asked. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself becoming more and more withdrawn. I couldn't bring myself to be around him for too long. Every time I looked at him, I saw a man I no longer recognized. A man who had done terrible things. A man who had hidden those things from me for years. The lies had been so carefully crafted, so perfectly woven into the fabric of our life together, that it was hard to know what was real anymore. Our entire relationship felt like a facade. How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted someone who was capable of such darkness? I started to pull away from him emotionally, physically. I couldn't stand being near him. I couldn't stand the feeling that I had been lied to, that I had been living with a stranger all this time. And yet, despite everything, he still tried to make it work. He still tried to convince me that he was a different man, that the person I had loved was still there. But I couldn't see it anymore. The more he tried to apologize, the more I pushed him away. His words only made me angrier. The guilt in his eyes didn't make me feel sorry for him. It only made me hate him more. I realized then that there was no going back. I had to let go. Let go of the man I had loved. Let go of the life we had built. Because the truth was, there was nothing left to hold on to. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us grew heavier with every passing moment. It wasn't that we didn't speak. On the contrary, we spoke constantly. But the words between us no longer held meaning. They felt hollow, like we were going through the motions, pretending to be a married couple while everything inside me was breaking apart. I could hear the sound of his voice, but it felt distant, as if it were coming from a world far removed from mine. He tried to explain himself, but I couldn't bring myself to listen anymore. Every time he opened his mouth, I was reminded of the things he had done. I couldn't ignore the fact that the man I had married wasn't the man I thought he was. The truth was too much to bear, and every word he spoke just felt like an attempt to make everything disappear, like he was trying to erase the darkness that had been exposed. I didn't know how to respond anymore. I couldn't tell him that everything would be okay. I couldn't lie and say that I understood. I didn't understand. How could I? How could anyone understand the horrors he had been involved in, the things he had done in the name of duty? I was drowning in the weight of it all, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, I couldn't find the air to breathe. Some nights, I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wishing that I could just wake up from this nightmare. I would close my eyes and try to remember the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had held me close and made me feel safe. But that man was gone, and in his place was someone I didn't know, someone who had lived a life I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't help but wonder how I had been so blind. How had I not seen the signs? Had he always been this way? Was there always a part of him that was capable of such darkness? Or had the military turned him into something else entirely? The questions swirled in my mind, but no answers came. Only more confusion, more pain. I couldn't stay like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I had to face the truth, and that truth was that I no longer loved him. The man I had married, the man I had trusted with everything, was gone, and I was left alone, trying to figure out who I was without him. I remember the exact moment when I knew it was over. It wasn't a single event that broke me, but a culmination of everything I had learned and everything I had felt. It wasn't even a big fight or a dramatic confrontation. It was just a quiet, simple moment that made everything click into place. We were sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner. It had become a routine, one we had stuck to for years. We would eat together, talk about our day, and go on as if everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. As I looked at him across the table, I couldn't help but see the stranger he had become. The man I had once loved was just a shell, a person who had committed unspeakable acts and kept them hidden from me. He was telling me about something trivial, something that didn't matter. But as he spoke, I could hear the distance in his voice. The same distance that had grown between us over the past few weeks. The same distance that had been there since the truth came out. And in that moment, it hit me. I wasn't just falling out of love with him. I was falling out of love with the idea of him. The idea of the man I had built up in my mind. The man I thought I had married. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't pretend that things would get better. They wouldn't. They couldn't. This was it. I was done. I had reached my breaking point. He looked up from his plate, his eyes meeting mine. There was something in his gaze, something vulnerable, but it didn't matter. He was still the man who had betrayed me, and that man no longer had a place in my life. I stood up from the table, my hands trembling with emotion. He didn't understand. He never did. He thought that he could explain his way out of this, but it was too late. The damage had been done. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were the truth. It wasn't just about the military or the things he had done. It was about everything. The lies, the betrayal, the realization that I no longer recognized the man I had once loved. He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at me, his expression unreadable. But I could see the hurt in his eyes. And yet, it didn't matter. The pain I felt was too deep to ignore, too consuming to push aside. I need you to leave, I said, my voice firm this time. I need space. I need to figure out what's left of me, what I'm supposed to do now. His face crumpled in pain, but there was nothing he could say to make it right. Nothing that could undo the years of lies and secrets. The days after he left were a blur of emotions. I couldn't find peace, but I also couldn't find the strength to fall apart completely. It was like I was stuck in a limbo, not quite able to move forward, but not able to go back to what we had either. There was no going back. That life was over. I spent my days in a haze, trying to put one foot in front of the other. I was alone for the first time in years, and the loneliness was suffocating. But at the same time, I felt a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't pretending. I wasn't living a lie. I started going through the motions, cleaning, working, eating, but my mind was constantly on him, on what had happened, on how I had gotten here. The anger still lingered, but there was also a sense of clarity. I was free, and I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew it was the first step toward something new. But even though he was gone, the weight of everything he had done still hung over me. I wasn't sure I would ever be able to shake the feeling of betrayal. I didn't know if I would ever truly forgive him. Maybe I didn't have to. Maybe that wasn't what healing looked like. I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this define me. I wasn't going to let him, or the military, or the lies control my life anymore. I would find a way to move forward. And it started with taking the first step toward healing, even if that meant facing the hardest truth of all, letting go. I'd like to tell you that after he left, I was strong, but that would be a lie. I had my moments of weakness, moments where I found myself questioning everything, even my decision to ask him to leave. There were nights when I lay in bed, my thoughts a chaotic mess, and I would wonder if I had made the wrong choice. Maybe I was too quick to judge him. Maybe I should have given him a second chance to explain himself. I knew I shouldn't have, but sometimes the loneliness would become too overwhelming. Sometimes, the hurt would fade just enough for me to question whether I was being too harsh. There were nights when I would pick up my phone, about to dial his number, only to stop myself at the last second. My heart was torn in two. But then, the memories would flood back. The way he'd kept secrets from me. The way he had lied to my face for years. The promises he had made and broken. How could I ever trust him again? How could I let him back into my life after everything that had happened? I didn't know if I would ever have an answer to those questions. And so, I held my ground. Even when the loneliness became unbearable, I reminded myself that I couldn't go back, that I deserved better than a life built on lies. But that didn't make the pain of missing him any easier to bear. The first day after he left was the hardest. I couldn't even get out of bed. The silence in the house was deafening. For so many years, we had shared everything: laughter, tears, secrets, dreams. And now, it was just empty. I sat there, in the same place we had shared countless moments, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of everything. For the first time in years, I was free. But what did that freedom mean? I wasn't sure. It was hard to embrace something that felt so unfamiliar. I had spent so long living in the shadow of his secrets that I didn't know who I was without him. But as the hours dragged on, something in me began to shift. The heaviness of the moment started to lift, even if just a little. I couldn't change the past, but I could decide what I wanted to do with my future. I could learn how to be me again. I got out of bed, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. I watched the world go by, feeling like a stranger in it. I felt like I was waking up from a long, painful dream. There were no answers, no guarantees. But I realized maybe that was okay. It wasn't easy, but slowly, I began to sift through the memories. I went through our old photographs, the ones that had once made me smile, the ones that now only reminded me of what I had lost. I'd kept everything: tickets from vacations, letters, gifts. Each item seemed like a piece of a puzzle I was desperately trying to put together, but the pieces no longer fit. I found a picture of our wedding day, him, smiling so brightly, and me, with the same smile, full of hope and love. I touched the photo gently, and for a moment, I allowed myself to remember how it felt before everything changed. But the memories weren't as clear as they used to be. They were muddied now, tinged with the knowledge of his betrayal. I wanted to hate him, and sometimes I did. But other times, I missed him. I missed the man I thought he was, the man who had held my hand and promised me forever. I missed the way we used to laugh together, the way he would hold me close at night. But the more I looked at these memories, the more I realized that the person I missed wasn't the person who had walked out the door. The man who had left was someone I could never love again. It had been weeks since I last heard from him, but one evening, my phone rang. My heart skipped a beat when I saw his name on the screen. I didn't know whether to answer it or not, but before I could decide, my finger pressed the green button. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe I thought he would beg for forgiveness. Maybe I thought he would tell me he made a mistake. But when I heard his voice, it wasn't what I anticipated. It wasn't full of regret, or sorrow, or pleading. It was calm, too calm for my liking. "I miss you," he said softly. "I know things are complicated, but I just wanted to hear your voice." I wanted to scream at him, tell him that he had no right to call me. But instead, I just stayed silent, listening to the sound of his breathing through the phone. It made me feel nauseous. I was reminded of everything I had tried so hard to forget. "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice shaky. "You can't just call me like this. You don't get to pretend everything's okay." "I know," he said quietly, "but I still care about you. I want you back. I don't care about the past. I just want us to be together." I felt the anger rise up in me, but I held it back. "I don't know who you are anymore," I whispered, "and I don't want to know. I can't go back to what we were. I've changed. You've changed. We're not the same people." There was a long silence on the other end. "I understand," he said, his voice hollow, "but I'll always care about you. I just want you to know that." The call ended with no closure, no resolution. It left me with more questions than answers, and a heart full of confusion. I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't that. The call didn't change anything. If anything, it only reinforced the decision I had made. I couldn't go back. I couldn't forgive him for what he had done, for the lies he had told. The military, his involvement, the things he had kept hidden from me. It was all too much. But as much as I hated everything he had been a part of, I knew something important. I couldn't keep holding on to the past. I couldn't keep letting him have this hold over me. It was time to let go. It was time to face the future. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that I couldn't keep living in this limbo. I had to move on, even if it meant walking away from everything I had known. I wasn't sure what my future held, but I was ready to face it. I was ready to live my life for me. The days passed in a blur. I was getting better at moving forward, at least in small ways. I started taking long walks every morning, trying to clear my head and find peace in the silence. The world felt different now, brighter in some ways and colder in others. I had to adapt to a life I hadn't asked for, but it was mine, and I had no choice but to embrace it. But even in the quiet, the truth kept gnawing at me. How had I allowed myself to become so entangled in his world? How had I let him pull me into the chaos of it all? The military, the secrets, the lies. None of it was mine, yet it had become my burden. I had always been so trusting, so eager to believe in the good in people, in him. And now, I felt foolish. I didn't want to keep carrying this weight. But the truth was that I was still tangled in the web he had spun. The things I had learned about him, about the horrors he had been involved in, had broken something inside me. I would never be the same, and I wasn't sure I could ever fully heal. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about him. Was he the person I thought he was before? Or had he always been this stranger, hidden beneath layers of charm and lies? I still didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. I had to let go. I had to move forward, even if it meant facing the unknown. It was hard to ignore the past, especially when it had shaped everything I had once believed in. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and the memories would flood back. I couldn't stop thinking about the man I had married, the man I had trusted. I remembered the way he had looked at me with so much love, with so much promise. How had it all gone so wrong? I remembered how we met, how easy it was to fall for him. He had been charming, attentive, always there when I needed him. I thought we were building something real, something lasting. But now, it all felt like a lie. The love, the promises, the future we had talked about. It all seemed so hollow in light of the things I now knew. And yet, there were still moments when I missed him. I hated myself for it, but it was the truth. I missed the man he had once been, or at least the man I had believed him to be. But the reality was too painful to ignore. The man I had married was not the man I had thought he was, and that truth was too much to bear. The hardest part was knowing that I would never have the answers I needed. I would never truly understand why he had kept all these secrets from me, why he had chosen to live a life that was so far removed from the one we had shared. I wanted closure, but I knew I would never get it. One morning, I woke up and decided that I couldn't keep living in the past. I couldn't keep mourning the life I had lost. I had to find a new path, one that didn't involve him, one that didn't involve the shadow of his actions. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready. I didn't know exactly where that path would take me, but I knew it had to be forward. I couldn't keep looking over my shoulder, wondering what might have been or what could have been different. It was time to look ahead. I started small. I began with things that brought me comfort, things that were just for me. I enrolled in a class, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I started cooking again, experimenting with new recipes, rediscovering the joy of being alone and independent. Slowly, I began to rebuild the pieces of myself that had been lost. It felt good to remember who I was outside of our marriage. It felt good to do things for me, without worrying about anyone else. One afternoon, while I was out running errands, I ran into someone from my past. It was an old friend from before everything with him, the life I had before I was swept into his world. Her name was Claire, and we had lost touch when I married. She looked at me with surprise when she saw me walking down the street. "Is that really you?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine warmth. I smiled, feeling a mix of emotions. It had been so long since I had seen anyone from that time in my life. "Yeah, it's me," I replied, the words tasting foreign in my mouth. I wasn't the same person I had been when we last saw each other. But as we stood there, talking, I could feel the weight of the years that had passed, the choices I had made. We talked for a while, catching up on each other's lives. She asked about my husband, and I found myself struggling to find the words. It wasn't that I didn't want to share the truth, but I wasn't ready to explain everything. I wasn't ready to dive back into the painful memories. Instead, I just smiled and told her that we were taking a break. That seemed to satisfy her, and we continued talking about lighter topics. But as I walked away from our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had been a sign. A reminder that there was still life beyond the world I had been living in. There was still a chance for something new. As time went on, I found myself wrestling with a question that I hadn't considered before. Could I ever forgive him? It wasn't something I had thought about much in the early days after he left. I was too consumed by the pain, the anger, and the betrayal to even consider the idea of forgiveness. But now, as I tried to piece my life back together, the question lingered in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what he had done. It wasn't about pretending that everything was okay. It was about releasing the hold his actions had on me. It was about freeing myself from the anger and the bitterness that had consumed me for so long. I didn't know if I was ready for that, but I knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be for me, not for him. One evening, as I sat by the window, sipping tea, I found myself staring at a blank piece of paper. It had been months since I had heard from him, and yet, I still had questions. So many things I wanted to say to him, things I knew I could never say in person. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, it all still lingered inside me. But I wasn't sure if writing the letter would bring any clarity. Would it help me heal, or would it reopen old wounds? I picked up the pen anyway. There was something therapeutic about putting my thoughts down on paper, even if I never intended to send it. I started by writing about the things that had been left unsaid, the lies, the betrayal, the pain of knowing that he had lived a life I had never known about. I wrote about the way he had looked at me with such love, only for it to be a mask covering a darker truth. I wrote about the way I had trusted him, completely, without question, and how that trust had been shattered. But then, as the words flowed, something shifted in me. The anger that had once felt all-consuming began to fade, replaced by a quiet sadness. I wasn't writing this to hurt him. I wasn't writing it to accuse him or to seek revenge. I was writing it because I needed to release it. I needed to make peace with it, even if that meant doing it alone. When I finished the letter, I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to burn it, to erase every trace of him from my life. Another part of me wanted to send it, to make him face the consequences of his actions. But I knew that wouldn't bring me the closure I needed. So, I folded the letter, tucked it away, and decided it was enough to simply let it go. In the months that followed, I began to focus more on my own well-being. I realized that in order to move forward, I had to find peace within myself. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew there would be days when the past would resurface, but I couldn't let it define me anymore. I found a sense of calm in the small things. Walking through the park, reading a book, cooking a meal for myself. These simple moments brought me a quiet joy that I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if I was reconnecting with parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of my past. But even as I began to heal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. I didn't want to be defined by my pain, but I also didn't want to forget it. It had shaped who I was, and I couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. I realized that forgiveness wasn't something that came easily. It was a journey, not a destination. I didn't know if I would ever fully forgive him, but I did know this. I was no longer living for the man I had loved. I was living for me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. It wasn't until I ran into him again that I realized just how far I had come. It happened one afternoon as I was picking up groceries. I had just turned the corner into the produce section when I saw him standing there, holding a bag of apples in his hand. My heart stopped. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. I hadn't seen him in so long, hadn't even thought about the possibility of running into him. He looked the same, but somehow different. There was a distance in his eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. A lack of the warmth that used to be there. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to turn and walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But the other part of me, the part that had grown stronger over the past few months, knew that this moment would come. And when it did, I had to face it head-on. He saw me before I had a chance to move, and his expression shifted. A mixture of surprise and something else. Guilt, maybe. "Hey," he said, his voice tentative. I forced a smile, trying to keep my composure. "Hey," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. We stood there for a moment, neither of us sure of what to say next. Finally, he spoke again. I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to see you either, I said, my tone light but firm. There was an awkward silence, and for a moment, it felt like we were two strangers standing in the same space, unsure of who the other person was anymore. I've been thinking a lot, he said quietly, about everything. About us. I nodded, even though I didn't need to hear his apology. I had already forgiven him in my own way, not for him, but for me. I had to let go of the anger, or it would consume me forever. You don't need to say anything, I told him. I've moved on. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Relief, maybe, or regret. I couldn't tell. I'm glad you're doing okay, he said, his voice softer now. I really am. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. There was no love left between us, no longing, no hope. Just two people who had once shared a life but had gone in different directions. I'm okay, I said, and I meant it. And you need to be too. We stood there for another moment, before he gave me a small nod and walked away. And as I watched him disappear down the aisle, I realized that I had finally let go. After running into him, I felt a sense of calm settle over me that I hadn't expected. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, one I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I had seen him, spoken to him, and now it was over. There was nothing left to hold on to, no more what-ifs or lingering questions. The future that I had once imagined with him was gone, and in its place was something new, a future I had to build on my own. I spent the next few weeks focusing on the small things that had begun to fill the gaps in my life. I redecorated my apartment, adding personal touches that reflected who I was now, not who I had been before. I joined a yoga class, something I had always been curious about but never had the time for. It wasn't just about staying active. It was about reconnecting with myself, finding peace in my own body, and it helped. The more I focused on myself, the less I thought about him and the life we had once shared. I started meeting new people, too. Nothing serious, just casual conversations that reminded me that there was a whole world out there beyond the confines of my past. I wasn't looking for a relationship, but I was beginning to see that life still held possibilities. And that was something I hadn't allowed myself to believe for a long time. I had no illusions about what I had been through, but I also knew that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my former life. The world was wide, and I was ready to explore it. It was around this time that I reconnected with an old friend from college, someone I had lost touch with after getting married. Her name was Natalie, and we had been inseparable back in those days. We used to stay up late talking about our dreams, our futures, the things that mattered most to us. But then life happened, and I had drifted away, focusing all my energy on my marriage. When she reached out to me, I didn't hesitate. I was eager to catch up, to reconnect with someone who knew me before everything had changed. Our first meeting was like no time had passed at all. We laughed about old memories, talked about the people we used to be, and shared where life had taken us since then. It felt so refreshing to have a conversation that wasn't clouded by the pain of the past. Natalie listened to my story with an open heart, never judging, only supporting. She didn't offer advice. She just let me speak, and that was all I needed. I didn't realize how much I had missed having a friend like her. We made plans to meet regularly, and soon, it became a regular part of my life. Spending time with her helped me realize how important it was to nurture the friendships I had neglected. I wasn't alone in this world, and I didn't have to go through everything on my own. One evening, as I sat on my couch, scrolling through my phone, I found myself thinking about something I hadn't in a while: dating. It wasn't that I was desperate for a relationship, but the idea of sharing my life with someone again didn't seem as impossible as it once had. I had spent so much time focused on the damage caused by my marriage that I had forgotten what it was like to simply enjoy someone's company, to be open to the possibility of love again. I wasn't ready for anything serious, not yet, but I did realize that I had to start thinking about the future in a different way. I had to open my heart again, even if just a little, because life was still happening. And if I was going to fully heal, I had to allow myself the chance to move forward. I downloaded a dating app, but only to test the waters. I wasn't looking for anything specific. It was more about putting myself out there, even in a small way. It felt strange at first, as if I was betraying the person I had been, the woman who had once been so committed to her marriage. But deep down, I knew this was part of my healing process. It wasn't about replacing what I had lost. It was about embracing the idea that there was still room for new experiences, new connections in my life. As I explored the dating app, I found myself feeling a strange mix of excitement and fear. There were moments when I doubted myself, wondering if I was ready to open up to someone else, to trust again. But the more I swiped through profiles, the more I realized that I was learning to let go of the fear. One evening, I decided to meet someone for coffee. His name was Ben, and we had exchanged a few messages before deciding to take the next step. He seemed nice, normal even, and there was something about his calm demeanor that put me at ease. The date went well, better than I expected. We talked about everything from books to travel, and I found myself laughing more than I had in a long time. It wasn't the start of anything significant, but it was a reminder that I could still connect with people in a meaningful way. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe love wasn't as far out of reach as I had thought. It wasn't something I was actively searching for, but I knew that the future was full of possibilities. And that was enough for now. The days seemed to pass faster as I continued exploring this new chapter of my life. There were moments of excitement, moments of doubt, and moments of deep reflection. I was constantly discovering parts of myself that I had either forgotten or never known in the first place. One afternoon, while walking by a mirror in my hallway, I stopped and looked at my reflection. It was a strange feeling, really seeing myself. After everything that had happened, I no longer recognized the woman who had been so consumed by the past, so tied to someone who didn't deserve my loyalty. But looking at myself now, I felt a sense of pride, even if it was small. I had made it through. I was still here. I wasn't perfect. I still had my scars, but they no longer defined me. I had taken control of my life again, and that was something worth celebrating. The person staring back at me wasn't the same woman who had been lost in a marriage that had fallen apart. She was stronger, wiser, and more independent, and she was finally beginning to forgive herself for all the things she had allowed herself to endure. It was a long road ahead, but I knew I could face it. I hadn't expected to hear from him again, but one day, my phone rang, and his name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I was ready for this, ready to revisit the past or entertain anything he had to say. But curiosity got the best of me, and I answered. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Hey, it's me," he said, his voice cautious. "I know it's been a while, and I don't expect you to want to talk to me, but I need to tell you something." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Part of me wanted to hang up right then and there, to protect myself from whatever he was about to say. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt and confused for so long, wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear the truth, even if it was too late. "I don't know what you want me to say," I replied. "But you've made your choices. We've both made ours." "I know," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But there's something I need to admit to you. Something I've never told you before. It's about my time in the military." I felt a chill run through me, as if the past was reaching out to pull me back into its grasp. "I'm listening," I said, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear what was coming next. "I wasn't just involved in the things you know about," he continued. "There were things that I did that I can't take back. And I've been living with that guilt every day. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I owe you the truth." I listened as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging heavy between us. He confessed to things I couldn't fully comprehend, things that left me with even more questions than answers. I felt numb, as if the world around me had shifted in ways I couldn't control. It wasn't about the actions he had taken, though they were heinous. It was about the fact that I had spent years believing in him, in a man who had been living a completely different reality. And now, after all this time, he was finally admitting it. But why now? Why after everything had already fallen apart? "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. "I don't know," he replied. "Maybe because I don't want to carry this alone anymore. Maybe because I can't keep running from the truth. I've been hiding from it for too long." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell at him, to tell him how much he had destroyed my life. But the other part of me, The part that was tired of being consumed by anger and hurt, just wanted to hang up and never hear from him again. I don't know what to do with this, I said quietly. I can't fix it. I can't change what happened. I know, he said softly. I don't expect you to. I didn't know what I expected from this conversation. Maybe closure, maybe an apology. But I got neither. Instead, I was left with more questions and a heavier heart than before. Still, it wasn't a call for reconciliation. It wasn't an invitation back into his life. It was just another chapter, a painful reminder of how far we had drifted apart. I need to go, I said, my voice firm. Take care of yourself. Before he could respond, I hung up. I didn't feel better, but I didn't feel worse either. I just felt tired. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the phone call, but I couldn't bring myself to analyze it either. Part of me wanted to process it, to understand what it all meant, but the other part just wanted to forget it happened. Healing isn't a straight path, I had learned. There were moments when it felt like I was making progress, and then there were days when it felt like I was back at square one. But I was learning to accept that. I wasn't going to wake up one day and be completely healed. I wasn't going to wake up and forget everything that had happened, but I could move forward, one step at a time. I took small steps, meeting new people, trying new things, and leaning on my friends when I needed them. I didn't know what the future held, but I was beginning to believe that it could be bright, that I could have a life beyond the pain, beyond the scars. I didn't need him. I didn't need his apology or his confession. I only needed myself. And slowly, I was finding the courage to move forward. A few weeks after the phone call, I found myself reflecting on the one word that had been echoing in my mind: forgiveness. It seemed like such a simple concept, but in reality, it felt anything but. I had told him I wasn't asking for an apology, but deep down, I realized I was still grappling with the idea of forgiveness, not for him, but for myself. I had spent so much time angry and hurt, but somewhere along the way, I realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me. I couldn't move forward if I was still chained to the past. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving him of his wrongdoings. It wasn't about excusing his actions. It was about freeing myself from the burden of carrying that weight. I spent days thinking about what it would mean to forgive him, to forgive myself, to let go of the guilt I had carried, believing that somehow I had been complicit in everything that had happened. But the truth was, none of it was my fault. I had been deceived, manipulated, and controlled by a person I thought I knew. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something that could be rushed. It wasn't a switch that could be flipped. It was a journey, and I was still on it. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't even know if I was ready to fully forgive him or if I ever would. But I knew that I was willing to try. I was willing to release the past, not for him, but for me. One evening, as I sat with Natalie at a small cafe, sipping my coffee and talking about life, I realized how much my perspective had shifted. It had been a year since I first started this journey of healing, and so much had changed. I was no longer the woman who had been consumed by heartbreak. I was no longer the woman who had allowed someone else to dictate her happiness. I was stronger, more self-assured, and most importantly, I was starting to truly understand what it meant to be at peace with myself. What do you think? Natalie asked, looking at me with a smile. Do you feel like you've turned a corner? I thought about it for a moment, the weight of her question sinking in. I think I've stopped looking for closure, I said slowly. I used to think that there was some moment, some revelation, that would make everything make sense. But now I realize that it's not about finding closure. It's about finding peace, even without all the answers. She nodded thoughtfully. I think that's the key. You've been looking for something to fix it, but sometimes it's just about learning how to live with it. I smiled at her, feeling a sense of gratitude for the friendship that had helped me so much. I didn't have everything figured out, but I had learned something important. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making room for a future that was mine to create. As time went on, I slowly began to open my heart to the idea of trust again. I wasn't rushing into anything, but I was allowing myself to believe that it was possible to trust someone. Maybe not him, but someone. I met someone new, someone who was kind and patient and didn't expect anything from me. His name was Ethan, and we met through a mutual friend. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want to put myself in a position to be hurt again. But Ethan was different. He understood the importance of patience. He didn't push me. He simply showed up, day after day, with a gentle presence that helped me remember that not everyone was like the man I had married. We began talking more, and slowly, I started to feel comfortable in his company. I realized that I wasn't looking for him to fix me, nor did I need him to. I was simply learning to be with someone who respected my boundaries, who didn't rush me to move on, but was willing to let things unfold naturally. I knew it was too soon to jump into a relationship, but I also knew that I was learning to trust again, little by little. And that felt like a step forward, a sign that I was healing, even if it was in small, quiet ways. It wasn't just about trust and forgiveness. It was also about rediscovering the joy in life that had been overshadowed for so long. I started saying yes to more things, small adventures, spontaneous outings, and even moments of silliness that made me laugh harder than I had in ages. I went to an art exhibit one Saturday, and I spent hours wandering through the gallery, lost in the beauty of the paintings. I found myself smiling at the colors, the brushstrokes, the stories that each piece told. It was a reminder that life, even in its darkest moments, still held beauty. I went to a local concert with Natalie, dancing in the crowd and laughing without a care in the world. I didn't care that I was out of sync with the rhythm. I didn't care if anyone was watching. I was just living in the moment, letting the music fill me with a sense of freedom. And then there were the quiet moments at home, reading a book, baking a new recipe, sitting on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the sunset. I was finally starting to embrace the simple pleasures in life, and I realized that joy had never truly left me. It had just been buried under layers of pain and fear, but it was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. It was in these moments, these small moments of quiet joy, that I began to realize something profound. The past didn't define me anymore. The woman I was before, the one who had been deceived, who had loved someone who didn't deserve it, was still a part of me. But she was no longer the whole of who I was. She was just one chapter in a much larger story. The experiences, the pain, the lessons, they were all part of the tapestry of my life. But they didn't control my future. I controlled it. I was the one who got to decide what came next, and that was a powerful realization. As I looked ahead, I didn't know exactly what the future would hold. But I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to face it, no matter what. As time passed, I began to understand just how much of my past had been shaped by the weight of others' expectations. I had been so consumed by what I thought I should be, by what I thought others wanted from me, that I had lost touch with who I really was. This was a part of myself that had been buried beneath layers of obligation and fear. I had to come to terms with the fact that I had allowed my identity to be defined by everyone else around me, especially by the man I had once loved. It wasn't easy to break free from this self-imposed prison. After all, I had spent years trying to meet those expectations, to be the wife, the perfect partner, the one who always put everyone else's needs before my own. But now, I realized that this kind of self-sacrifice wasn't healthy. It wasn't sustainable, and it certainly didn't lead to fulfillment. It took months of soul-searching, of sitting with uncomfortable feelings, to begin to unlearn these patterns. I started asking myself difficult questions. Who am I outside of what others expect me to be? What do I want? What truly makes me happy? At first, the answers didn't come easily. I had spent so many years ignoring my own desires in favor of others. But slowly, those answers began to emerge, quietly, tentatively at first. I wanted peace. I wanted to feel at home in my own skin again. I wanted freedom from the expectations that had weighed so heavily on my shoulders. It was a journey, but it was a necessary one. And the further I went down this road of self-discovery, the more I realized how much power I had over my own life. I wasn't beholden to anyone's idea of who I should be. I was allowed to write my own story, and that knowledge was freeing. One of the hardest things I had to learn in my healing process was how to set boundaries. For so long, I had been conditioned to say yes to everything, to put everyone else's needs ahead of my own. I had been afraid of conflict, of disappointing others. But as I began to rebuild my life, I realized that boundaries were a necessary part of self-care. I started small, saying no to things that drained my energy, letting go of relationships that didn't serve me. It wasn't easy at first. People weren't used to me setting limits. I had been the one who always bent over backward to make everyone happy, and now I was learning to stand firm. I was learning that it was okay to prioritize myself, that it didn't make me selfish. It made me healthy. At first, some of my boundaries were met with resistance. Some people didn't understand why I couldn't do everything for them, why I needed space, why I had to say no. But the more I practiced setting boundaries, the more I realized that those who truly cared about me would respect them. And those who didn't, well, they weren't meant to be part of my journey anyway. It was a freeing realization. I was learning to take care of myself, to protect my peace. And in doing so, I was creating the space I needed to grow. As I settled into this new phase of my life, something unexpected happened. I began to rediscover passions I had long since abandoned. For years, I had sacrificed the things that made me feel alive. Art, writing, even the simple joy of exploring new places. I had put all my energy into a relationship that had drained me, leaving me with little to give to myself. But now, I had time. I had space. And slowly, I began to reclaim the things that had once brought me joy. I took up painting again. I wasn't a master by any means, but I found solace in the colors and the brushstrokes. There was something incredibly therapeutic about creating something from nothing. I would lose myself in the canvas, in the rhythm of the brush moving across the surface. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free to create without expectation, without pressure. I also began writing again. It was something I hadn't done in a long time, but there was a part of me that had always longed to express myself through words. So I began journaling, pouring my thoughts, my hopes, my fears onto the pages. And it felt good. It felt like I was finally letting go of all the things I had been holding inside for so long. I even signed up for a weekend getaway with a few friends, something I would never have done before. We went hiking in the mountains, enjoying the beauty of nature, the quiet stillness that surrounded us. I had forgotten how much I loved being in nature, how it made me feel connected to something bigger than myself. It was a reminder that life was full of beautiful, unexpected moments, and that I was worthy of experiencing them. Rediscovering these passions was like reconnecting with pieces of myself that had been lost. It was a reminder that I wasn't just someone's wife or partner. I was a person with dreams, with desires, with the right to live a life that fulfilled me. Despite all the progress I had made, there was still a part of me that was afraid. Afraid of being hurt again, afraid of trusting others, afraid of truly opening my heart to the possibility of love. The wounds from my past were still there, even if they weren't as raw as they had once been. And the fear of falling into the same traps, of repeating the mistakes I had made in my marriage, was something that lingered in the back of my mind. But I knew that I couldn't live in fear forever. I couldn't let my past define my future. And so, little by little, I began to confront those fears. It started with small steps. I allowed myself to be vulnerable with people, something I had shied away from before. I opened up to Natalie more, sharing the things I had kept hidden for so long. I didn't try to be perfect anymore. I simply allowed myself to be human, flaws and all. I also began to let go of my fear of intimacy. I didn't jump into a relationship, but I allowed myself to be open to the idea. I went on dates with Ethan and other people, learning to trust my instincts, to enjoy the moment without expecting anything too serious too soon. Facing my fears wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had to remind myself that life, with all its uncertainties, was worth living. That even if I stumbled, even if I got hurt again, I could survive. I had survived before. As time passed, I began to trust my intuition more and more. After everything I had gone through, I knew I couldn't rely on anyone else's judgment but my own. I had spent so many years ignoring my gut, pushing away the warnings that had been there all along. But now, I listened to that inner voice, the one that whispered the truth to me when I was too afraid to hear it. It wasn't always easy, but it was empowering. I started making decisions based on what felt right for me, rather than what others thought was best. I learned to say no when I needed to walk away from situations that didn't align with my values, and to embrace the opportunities that felt like the right fit. Trusting myself was the key to my healing. I had spent too long relying on others to tell me who I was and what I needed. But now, I was learning to trust my own judgment, to listen to my own heart. And that was a powerful realization. There was something liberating about letting go. Letting go of the past. Letting go of old wounds. Letting go of the person I had been before. It wasn't that I was erasing everything that had happened to me, but I was learning to no longer let it control me. I was learning to accept that the pain of my past had shaped me, but it didn't have to define me. For so long, I had held on to everything: grudges, anger, resentment, and fear. I thought that by holding on to these feelings, I was somehow protecting myself. But in reality, I was only hurting myself. I was carrying around a heavy weight, one that I didn't need to bear anymore. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing the things that had been done to me. It simply meant choosing not to let them have power over me anymore. It meant choosing peace over chaos, freedom over imprisonment. I spent more time reflecting on what I needed to let go of. Some things were obvious. The anger towards my ex-husband, the shame I had carried for years, the fear of being vulnerable. But other things were harder to recognize. Old patterns of behavior that I had been conditioned to accept, relationships that no longer served me, and even the guilt I had felt for wanting a life of my own. Letting go was a slow process. It didn't happen overnight. But with each passing day, I felt a little lighter, a little freer. And with that freedom came a new sense of possibility. I was no longer tethered to a past that had held me hostage for so long. I was free to move forward, to explore new avenues of life, and to write a new story. In the months that followed, I began to realize just how much power I had over my own life. I had spent so much time giving that power away to others, allowing my ex-husband to control my emotions, my choices, my self-worth. But now, I was reclaiming it. It wasn't about being angry or vengeful. It was about recognizing that I had the ability to shape my own destiny. I didn't need anyone's approval to be happy. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. I was enough, just as I was. This realization wasn't instantaneous. It came in waves, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. But with each moment, I felt more and more empowered. I was making decisions for myself, not based on what others thought I should do, but based on what felt right for me. I also began to recognize the strength that had always been inside of me, even when I didn't see it. I had survived. I had endured. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, and that was something I could be proud of. I started setting new goals for myself, personal goals that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. I wanted to travel more, to experience the world in a way I had never allowed myself to before. I wanted to continue painting and writing, to see where those passions would take me. And most of all, I wanted to continue growing, to keep becoming the woman I was meant to be. Reclaiming my power wasn't about conquering anyone else. It was about conquering my own fears, my own doubts, my own limitations. And in doing so, I was creating a life that was truly mine. Through all of this, I realized something important. I couldn't do it alone. As much as I had learned to stand on my own 2 feet, I also needed the support of others. I needed community. I had spent so many years isolating myself, thinking that I had to figure everything out by myself. But the truth was, I didn't have to. There was power in vulnerability, in leaning on others when I needed to. There was strength in asking for help, in allowing others to be part of my journey. I began to nurture the relationships that truly mattered, the ones that were built on trust, mutual respect, and love. I spent more time with my friends, particularly Natalie, who had been my rock throughout all of this. She had seen me at my lowest, and yet, she never judged me. She never made me feel like I was anything less than deserving of happiness. I also began reaching out to new people, people who shared my passions, my interests, my values. I joined a painting class, and I found myself surrounded by a group of like-minded individuals who were also on their own journeys of self-discovery. We bonded over our shared love of art, but also over our shared struggles and triumphs. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone in this world, that there were others who understood what I was going through. Community became a crucial part of my healing process. It was through the love and support of others that I was able to continue moving forward. And it was through those connections that I found the courage to keep growing. As the months went by, I began to feel like a new person. I wasn't the woman who had been betrayed, the woman who had been lost and broken. I was someone new, someone stronger, more resilient, and more self-assured. I had learned to let go of the things that no longer served me. I had learned to trust myself and to set boundaries. I had rediscovered my passions and allowed myself to be vulnerable. I had reclaimed my power, and in doing so, I had begun to write a new story for myself. And as I looked ahead, I saw a future full of possibilities. Possibilities I had once thought were out of reach. There was still uncertainty, still fear, but there was also hope. There was hope that, no matter what, I could face whatever came my way. Because I had faced the worst of it already, and I had survived. This was my life now, and it was mine to shape, to mold, to live fully. For the first time in a long time, I was excited about the future. Even though I had made tremendous progress, there were days when the past still crept in, uninvited, like an old shadow trying to remind me of things I had worked so hard to forget. It wasn't as if I was still deeply in pain, but it was more like a lingering ache, a reminder that healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, and on the days when I felt weak, I allowed myself to simply be vulnerable. I didn't push the pain away, nor did I let it define me. I simply acknowledged it. It's strange, you know? When you've been through something so traumatic, you think that once it's over, everything will be fine. But you don't realize how much of yourself you've lost in the process. For years, I had built walls around my heart, afraid that letting anyone close again would cause me the same kind of heartbreak I had suffered. Letting go of those walls was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But in the process, I was letting go of the person I had been. The person who was defined by fear, loss, and betrayal, and embracing the new version of myself. Still, the memories lingered. The memory of my ex-husband's secrets, the lies that had crushed me, and the realization that I had been so blind. I couldn't erase those memories, no matter how hard I tried. They were a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being. But I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. I would never forget the pain, but I had learned that there was power in letting go of resentment, in forgiving, not just for the sake of others, but for myself. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about finding peace. Peace that I could only find by releasing the hold my past had on me. The process of rebuilding relationships had been a slow one. After everything that had happened, it wasn't easy to trust people again. I had trusted once, and it had been shattered. But I knew that I couldn't stay closed off forever. I had to take the risk of opening myself up to others, even if it meant getting hurt again. But this time, I was different. I had learned to protect my peace. I had learned to set boundaries and to recognize the difference between people who truly valued me and those who were just passing through my life. My friendships deepened, especially with Natalie, who had been a steady presence through it all. She never pressured me to move faster than I was ready. She understood when I needed space and when I needed support. I also reconnected with my family. At first, it had been awkward. They didn't fully understand everything I had been through, and there were moments when I felt judged for the decisions I had made, for the pain I had experienced. But over time, I realized that they, too, had been carrying their own burdens, their own guilt for not being there when I needed them. It wasn't about blame. It was about healing, both individually and together. Rebuilding relationships wasn't always a smooth path, but it was a rewarding one. I learned that true relationships aren't about perfection. They're about being honest with each other, accepting each other's flaws, and knowing when to offer grace. As I moved further into this new chapter of my life, I began to embrace the uncertainty that came with it. I had spent so long seeking certainty, seeking control, but I had come to understand that life was unpredictable, and that was okay. I didn't need to know every detail of the future. I didn't need to have all the answers. What I needed was to trust in myself and in the process of life itself. It was a liberating feeling, to let go of the need to control everything. I allowed myself to simply live in the moment, to embrace the unknown with a sense of excitement rather than fear. The idea of uncertainty didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like an invitation to experience life fully, without expectations, without limitations. There were still times when I felt overwhelmed by the unpredictability of life, but now I had the tools to deal with it. I had learned to rely on my inner strength, to trust in my intuition, and to accept that I couldn't predict every outcome. Some things were out of my control, and that was okay. In embracing uncertainty, I found freedom. I found peace. One of the biggest steps in my journey was learning to open my heart again. After the betrayal, the hurt, the scars that ran deep, I had promised myself that I would never be vulnerable again. But as the months went by, I realized that I didn't want to live in that state of closed-off isolation. I didn't want to live in fear of being hurt. I had been so afraid of trusting someone again, afraid that history would repeat itself. But with time, I began to understand that love wasn't a danger. Love, when shared with the right person, wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace, to cherish. I started slowly, taking small steps towards opening my heart. I began allowing myself to be more vulnerable with people, letting them see the real me, the imperfect, messy, complicated version of myself. I stopped hiding behind walls and started allowing myself to experience the full range of emotions, both the joy and the pain. And then there was Ethan. He had been there for me from the beginning, not in any grand way, but in a quiet, steady, patient manner. He didn't pressure me to move faster than I was ready. He simply supported me. And in time, I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he was someone I could trust. I wasn't ready for a relationship yet, not fully, but I was open to the possibility. I was open to love again, in whatever form it would take. I wasn't rushing. I was letting things unfold naturally. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful part of the process. I didn't have to have everything figured out. I simply had to be present, to be open, and to trust that life would guide me where I needed to go. It's funny how life can surprise you, how the most unexpected moments can lead to the most profound changes. Looking back at everything I had been through, I could hardly recognize the woman I was when it all started. I had gone from feeling completely broken to discovering a strength I never knew I had. And now, I was living a life I could be proud of, a life where I was no longer defined by my past, a life where I was free to be myself, to pursue my passions, and to love without fear. I wasn't perfect, and I wasn't trying to be, but I was real, and I was finally living on my own terms. This journey wasn't easy, but it was worth every single step. It had taken courage, it had taken patience, and it had taken a willingness to trust the process of healing. And as I stood on the other side of it, I realized that I had learned the most important lesson of all. Life is not about avoiding the pain. It's about learning how to rise above it and become stronger because of it. The future was uncertain, but that was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace with open arms. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready, because I had faced the darkness, and I had emerged stronger than ever before. And now, I was living a life worth living. After everything I had been through, I thought I had forgotten what true joy felt like. It wasn't that I hadn't experienced moments of happiness over the years, but there was always a shadow of the past hanging over them, an unspoken sadness that clouded my ability to really feel free. It was like I had been waiting for permission to be happy again, waiting for the day when everything would finally feel right. But joy, I realized, wasn't something that came from external circumstances. It wasn't something that was handed to you. It was something that you created within yourself. It was a choice, a decision to embrace the present moment, to savor the small things, and to allow yourself to feel the fullness of life. I began to intentionally seek out joy in my everyday experiences. I noticed the way the sunlight streamed through my window in the mornings, how the warmth of a cup of coffee could soothe my soul. I allowed myself to laugh without guilt, to feel happiness without fear of it being taken away. Even the simple act of painting, something I had once done just for the sake of distraction, became a source of deep fulfillment. I felt the brush in my hand like an extension of my heart, and each stroke of color on the canvas became a declaration of my reclaiming my life. I no longer needed to fill the silence with the past. I was filling it with my own joy, my own creativity. And it wasn't just about the big moments or the grand milestones. It was about the small, quiet moments that made up a life. The comfort of a long walk through the park, the joy of spending time with friends, the simple pleasure of cooking a meal for myself. These moments, small as they seemed, added up to a life that was full of meaning. The more I embraced joy, the more I realized that I didn't need to wait for the perfect circumstances to experience it. I could create it at any moment just by being present and appreciating what I had. As I continued to grow, one thing became abundantly clear. Fear was still a part of my life, but it no longer had the power it once did. I had spent years living in fear of betrayal, in fear of being hurt, in fear of failure. Fear had kept me small, kept me from taking risks, and kept me from embracing the unknown. But as I began to heal, I realized that fear didn't have to control me. It was just a feeling, a temporary one, and I didn't need to give it more importance than it deserved. I didn't need to run from fear. I needed to face it. Facing my fears didn't mean I was fearless. It meant that I was choosing to move forward, even when I felt afraid. I began to recognize the moments when fear tried to take hold, and instead of shrinking back, I pushed through it. Every time I faced a fear, no matter how small, it became easier to do so the next time. It wasn't about eliminating fear entirely. It was about not letting it stop me. Fear might always be there, lurking in the background, but it was no longer the driving force in my life. I didn't have to let it dictate my decisions or my future. I started taking risks, small risks, like taking on a new project or pushing myself to meet new people. And with each risk, my confidence grew. The more I faced my fears, the more I realized that I was capable of handling whatever came my way. Fear had no power over me anymore. I learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to act in spite of it. And so, here I am, standing at the threshold of a new chapter. It's hard to put into words how far I've come, how much I've changed. The person I am today is not the person I was a year ago, or even 6 months ago. I've grown, I've healed, and I've learned to embrace life with open arms. I've learned that the past doesn't have to define me. I've learned that my mistakes don't have to be my story. And I've learned that I am worthy of love, of happiness, of peace. I don't know what the future holds. There are still uncertainties, still moments of fear, but now I welcome them. I embrace them, knowing that they are just part of the journey. I've learned to trust myself, to trust the process, and to trust that whatever comes my way, I will handle it with grace and strength. This is my life now, a life full of possibility, a life where I am not defined by what happened to me, but by who I choose to become. And as I move forward, I am ready for whatever comes next, because I know that no matter what, I have the power to create my own story.